I'm gonna break down how I went from this to this. Did I make it in the top 100? No, but I hope that doesn't take away the value from this video. So, on 5th Feb, Punisher announced the Endless Engine 3D Community Challenge with very enticing prizes and strict rules to follow.
Because their frame rate is off, frame count, resolution is off. There's always a handful of artists that end up in the pit of despair. I'm gonna show you.
One mistake and you're out. Anyway, I already had other projects queued up in my schedule, so I started on the 23rd Feb, which means I have 18 days to achieve this. This was the deadline, so let's start breaking this down. So I made the conscious effort to spend more time on the pre-production, making sure that I absolutely loved the story. Gone are the days where I'd spend days or weeks on something that I end up hating. Yeah. While I was working on other projects, I generated 5 different ideas, ranging from an ambitious, post-apocalyptic, cyberpunkish theme to a Family Guy tribute. Yeah, I was in my Family Guy phase, okay? Anyway, I landed on the idea of a caffeine addict chasing down a coffee delivery boy for coffee, who's supposedly riding on an impressive futuristic vehicle with thrusters along some street. So I had to ask myself, do I have enough time to execute this story? Can this story be conveyed within 5 seconds? One of the guidelines said, your vehicle is the hero of the scene. So should I spend more time on the vehicle over the characters? On paper, it made sense to do that, but my brand has always been character-centric, so I caved in and made the judgment call of splitting an equal amount of time frame for the creation of the 3 subjects. Once that has been decided, I began building upon this idea. After deciding that I liked this idea, I pulled up Procreate on my iPad and began designing the characters. I didn't exactly know what I wanted, so I pretty much freestyled until it worked. For the coffee delivery boy, I ended up going for rounded features, which at this point is my comfort go-to shape. For the caffeine addict, I went for sharper, squarish features because I wanted this character to look a little crazy, kinda like the Joker. Then, I blocked out a vehicle based on the Vespa. I knew that I wanted to have a container of coffee in the back of the vehicle, so it made sense to have 2 rear wheels. I thought that I should have a cart linked to the back of the 3-wheel Vespa, but I scrapped that idea and decided to mount it onto the vehicle itself. At this stage, I'm only using primitives like cylinders, cubes, and very simple shapes to very quickly put together a modded Vespa. I played around with the idea of the Vespa transforming into a flying bike, but couldn't make sense of how that would work, so I ditched that idea and instead had it transform into some kind of a dirt bike. On this day, I imported the blocked out Vespa into the scene to get a feel of what I was working with. This is what the template looks like. A null that is the parent of the test vehicle and a camera which animation was already baked in keyframes. This, I thought was gonna be a problem if I wanted to change the speed of the movement, but thankfully it was pretty easy to solve. I'll talk about this on day 15. Then it was time to animate the Previz. I animated the hand gestures of the characters with primitives and animated the vehicle transformation. This was mostly to test whether the story could really be conveyed within 5 seconds. I had to give the scene some background elements to judge the speed, so I dropped in a cube with an array modifier, but eventually I figured that I want the scene to take place in Venice, so I threw a bunch of cubes together and made some buildings and windows in the background. I thought this looked promising, so it was time to bring the characters to life. My process for character creation hasn't changed that much since my previous videos, so you could check them out if you want a more in-depth explanation, but I'll quickly talk about it here anyway. For characters with rounded features, I normally sculpt them to look like a bean. So from the front and the side, it should look like a bean. From the top, it should kind of look like an egg with protruding cheeks. I'm gonna use Joe's head here as a reference to show you what I'm thinking about when I'm sculpting heads. I'm no anatomy expert, but I always try to follow these guidelines for side profiles. Also, the brows are normally where the top of the ears are, and the nostrils are normally where the bottom of the ears are. Personally, I like to lower the ears just because they look cute that way, although we won't be making ears for our coffee delivery boy. So if I drew over the skull, it should look something like this. We can even exaggerate the bean shape a little by pushing the mouth out forward. Now I'm just gonna use the mask brush and mask the neck area, then use the grab brush to pull it out. Now normally I would use the clay brush to sculpt the placement of the eyes, but I'm gonna wing it and I'm just gonna sculpt in the eye sockets, and also I want to make sure that they're an eye distance apart. want. And now import TinyEye. So be sure to grab TinyEye 1.1.2. Now free on my Gumroad. Then scale it and move it around until it fits, then add a mirror modifier. Then I'm gonna sculpt in the mouth, and then with the grab brush tool, I'm gonna drag down the eyelids and crease brush to define it. Also, many of you have asked me about the matte cap that I use, and this is the one that I normally use. Now I'm gonna block out the helmet starting with a cube. Then I'm gonna apply a subdiv modifier, extrude and reposition the edges until it kind of looks like a helmet, and then solidify. Now for the hair proxy, I'm gonna start with a path curve and then turn snap to face project and reposition the points until it kind of looks like a curly hair strand. And then under geometry and bevel, I'm gonna turn up the depth, tweak the profile until it flattens the hair strand, and with Alt S you can change the scale of each point of a curve, then duplicate until you have a full set of hair. Control L to link materials. Now since my character is 3 heads tall, I'm gonna duplicate the heads and use it as a measurement. I'm gonna block out everything else, and the idea is pretty much the same. I'm gonna start with a cube and start adding loop cuts. Move around the edges and vertices until it kind of looks like the objects that we want to make. For the hands, same thing. We're gonna start with a cube. You could use your own hands as reference or look it up on Google, but this is how I observe a hand. Once again, I'm no anatomy expert, but you could break the hand down in these simple shapes. The palm and the middle finger should roughly be the same length, and you can break your fingers down into 2 segments. So from the knuckle to the first joint, and the first joint to the tip of the finger should be about the same length, and then you can divide the top portion into half. I'm going for 4 fingers because it's chunky. Okay, I'm just gonna block out everything else while keeping it simple since it's just a block out. I just want to create something that is readable before going too crazy with the details. This stage is kind of like a 3D equivalent of a sketch. Now for the Caffeine Addict, the process is pretty much the same. We don't want to go too crazy with the poly count, and we want to keep things simple and readable. The only difference being that he has ears and blockier features, and he looks like a psycho, so we won't be giving him a bean-shaped face. And yeah, I'm just gonna repeat whatever I did with the coffee delivery boy, and I'm just gonna speedrun this. Alright, now that we're done with the blockouts, I'm gonna assign very basic colors to the characters to make sure that they look cohesive. And then I'm gonna insert them into the Previz and replace the placeholders. And now it's time to refine the coffee delivery boy. Alright, so now I'm gonna refine the mesh by first remeshing and then hit shift and brush all over the surface. I'm gonna clean up the mesh and sculpt back in some details. Duplicate and separate different parts of the helmet for additional details. Now we're gonna bevel the edges where the elbow bends, and then we're gonna duplicate the faces for the elbow brace. Throw in a mirror modifier, bevel and delete the faces for that little hole thingy. Now for the pockets, extrude a single vertex and then fill in the mesh. Apply a solidify modifier and then do the exact same thing with the coffee logo. Now whatever I did with the elbow pads, I'm gonna do the same with the knee pads. And then we're gonna give the coffee delivery boy some goggles, and then let's refine his shoes. I'm not going for anything too complex. I'm just gonna separate the tongue of the shoes and then solidify it and then call it done. Now with the quad remesher add-on, I'm gonna automatically retopologize the mesh. At this point, I'm considering whether I should manually retopologize, but I don't want to waste too much time, so I'm gonna first fiddle around with the shape keys to see if the character can properly emote without having to manually retopologize. So I know that the character is going to puff out air as he sighs, so I'm only gonna create the mouth expressions that are necessary to accomplish that. Oh, and also I want to make sure that he's able to blink. Alright, so it looks like it works, so I'm gonna go ahead and waste more time by manually retopologizing anyway. So retopology is not a process that I often do, so I had to refer to this image over here. There's actually a substantial amount of ways to go about face topology, but the common consensus is that they have an eye region, a nose region, a mouth, and a smile region. Basically, you want to provide enough polygons for each group to properly stretch and function. For example, if you know that your character is going to blink, you'd want to give the eyelids enough loop cuts. That way there's enough edges for your lids to properly stretch. I feel like this is a concept you have to try it out for yourself to really grasp it. Alright, so I'm gonna select the shape key layer and I'm gonna move the vertices and faces accordingly, and then realize that I don't have enough polygons, so I'm gonna delete the shape keys and apply the subdiv modifier, then repeat what I just did. Then I'm gonna isolate the bottom lip since the lips are too close to one another. Grab wrap brush to sculpt the mouth open, and that's it. You can create as many layers as you want. I wanted to test to see if this really works, so I did a simple step animation. I keyframed some key poses and in-betweens and left the interpolation mode to constant instead of Bezier. If this sounds alien to you, no worries, I will elaborate on day 15. So now let's texture the coffee delivery boy. I'm gonna start marking the seams, ideally on where the seams would be on these clothes in real life. Press U to unwrap, and then I'm gonna rotate the UV islands until the numbers on the texture is set up right. Now, after selecting the faces and moving them into place, you can use the grab, relax, or pinch brush to move the distorted areas back into place. Then I'm gonna select the islands, average, scale, and then I'm gonna pack them and turn off rotate. Now, since I'm gonna be painting over the skin, I'm just gonna use the smart UV projection and then paint white all over the face to see if there are any overlapping islands. And then bit by bit, I'm gonna start painting in the blush. I'm gonna select the insides of the mouth and then isolate it and then paint in some dark red, some pink for the eyelids. So I just got the Sanctus library, which is great by the way, and I wanted to give it a try, but I had to create the texture of the jacket from scratch. In this case, I'm using the magic texture node for the fabric texture and then plug it into the bump node for some height details. The Sanctus library has this cool procedural velvet texture that was giving off this cool effect, and after inspecting it, turns out it was using a layer weight node, and I thought it was a good idea and was like, don't mind if I do. So I'm gonna use that for my own shader and then mix it with some noise texture and we're done. So everything else from here is pretty much like a drag and drop from the Sanctus library and then tweaking the settings a little bit since, as I mentioned, I just got the library and wanted to play around with the shaders. And I must say it's pretty nice. It pairs up really well with the already existing textures from Polyhaven and Polygon. Also on this day, I did a quick vehicle rig test, but I will explain that on day 14. So yeah, that sums up day 6. I just bought the AutoRig Pro add-on and this is my first time using it, and I have to say it's really fast to set up. I mean, just look at this. It's like if Mixamo was brought into Blender. It's not 100% perfect. I still have to go into rig in edit mode to make some tweaks, but in general, wow, it's fast. I'm probably gonna be using this a lot, not gonna lie. Now I'm gonna select the meshes, then the rig, and then parent with automatic weights. And look at that, we have a fully functional IKFK rig. This is literally me before any social activity. As for the knee and elbow pads, the pockets, and the coffee logo, instead of parenting them to the rig, I'm gonna use the surface deform modifier and bind them accordingly. Alright, now that they stick on the clothes, let's give him some hair. Add a particle system and select hair. Change the length. In this case, the number of hair doesn't matter because we're gonna be planting in our own hair. I'll show you what I mean in a bit. Anyway, under viewport display and render, I'm gonna turn up the strength steps to at least 5 since we're doing curly hair. Then I'm gonna create a new material for the hair. Then under render, I'm going to change the material to the new material that we just made. Make sure to change the strand type to strip. Then back in the particle settings, I'm going to change the diameter root to about 0.1 and the diameter scale to about 0.01. Now I'm going to turn the emission number down to 0, and this is what I mean by planting in our own hair. With the add tool selected and the path steps set to 5, I'm going to plant in the hair one at a time. Then with the comb brush, I'm going to comb the hair down, shorten the hair strand with the length tool. Under children, I'm gonna hit simple, turn down the children radius, and then select curl under kink. Then I'm gonna fiddle around with the settings until they look right. And then I'm gonna add in the rest of the hair and continue tweaking the settings until they look right. So here's the setup for my hair shader. You can pause the video if you want to inspect it. So the principled hair BSDF isn't supported in Eevee, and that means it appears black in a viewport like this. So to mitigate that, you can have 2 different material output nodes, one set to Eevee and one set to cycles. Now let's repeat these steps for the Caffeine Addict. Alright, so the process for the Caffeine Addict is pretty much the same as the coffee delivery boy. By the way, I should probably mention, if you end up liking the video, please leave a like, and if you want to see more of such content, feel free to subscribe. Alright, anyway, I'm just gonna let the video play just in case any one of you want to sit through the process of the Caffeine Addict. So the main differences between the process of these 2 characters are that the Caffeine Addict won't be emoting, so I won't be doing any manual retopology and any shape key animation. Also, there's a slight difference in the hair grooming, but I'll talk about that on day 9. So yeah, even the texturing process is pretty much identical, so that about concludes day 8. Alright, so I'm gonna select the faces where the hair would grow, make a new vertex group, assign, then name it density, new hair particle system, then under vertex group, assign density to density. So instead of using simple under children, I'm gonna use interpolated, and what it does is that it evenly distributes the child particles and mimics the behavior of the closest parent particles. This is ideal if you intend to create a full set of hair, but should be avoided on a sparse set of hair, and also if you want to create very specific small chunks of hair, just like what we did for the coffee delivery boy. So here's the hair shader, and that's all for day 9. To give me a head start, I'm gonna use the Vespa from Polygonix Traffic Library. Then I'm gonna break the Vespa apart and modify the model to match my blockout. So sometimes after modeling, for instance this pole type object, it doesn't pivot the way you want it to after setting the origin point to geometry. A quick solution of that is to instead select an edge loop or some vertices, then hit Shift S and set cursor to selected. Then right click, set origin a 3D cursor. And that's what I'm gonna do for this bike stand. Alright, now I'm gonna take the container from the back of my blockout, and then I'm gonna duplicate a part of it and use it as a base support. Subdiv and then move some of the vertices around, and then shrink wrap, solidify, and we have a base. I'm gonna flip the brake lights, add a bunch of pole thingies, break more things apart and add more things. I'm gonna give it a nice big red button. Now for the exhaust pipe, I'm gonna start with a cube, add some edge loops and separate them. I'm gonna move them around and experiment with different arrangements for the transformation. Okay, I'm gonna delete half of them and use a mirror modifier instead. Alright, select the rest, Control L and copy modifiers. Actually, we don't need the bottom half too, so let's delete that and set the axis to X and Y. I'm gonna make some slight adjustments and link materials. So after a bunch of refining, we're done and everything seems to be working just fine. So now it's time to texture the Vespa. For the body paint of the Vespa, I am once again going to use the Sanctus library. This time I'm going to use the Smart Metal V2 and tweak the settings until they look right. Since this shader uses ambient occlusion to generate dirt in cavities, I'm going to have to bake the textures. The baking process took me a while to figure out, but it's actually pretty simple. First of all, to have the textures baked accurately as presented in the viewport, it's ideal to turn off modifiers such as bevel and solidify. Then right click on the shader node, set Sanctus Bake Sockets, and pick whatever you need. I'm gonna pick all of them. Then I'm gonna press N and click on Sanctus, choose 4K, and then I'm gonna leave the samples at 4, then bake. The bake will take quite a while, but once it's done, all the textures are conveniently shown here for you to save them one at a time. I seriously love this feature. Now I'm gonna duplicate the glass container and delete the top portion, extrude and extrude, then fill, select the edge and Shift E to edge crease. I'm gonna make it brown and turn down the transmission to 0. Okay, I think we're gonna need more coffee. There we go. I did a sketch on Procreate for the coffee logo, and now we have a mask to put over the glass container. I'm just gonna use materials from Polygon and Polyhaven for the rest of the Vespa, and we're done. Now it's time to rig the Vespa. So to explain how I used Rig a Car to rig the Vespa, I have here a super polished vehicle to demonstrate. First of all, make sure that your vehicle is facing towards -y, or your numpad 1. Also, make sure that your vehicle sits right above the default grid. Then, of course, install Rig a Car, then hit Shift A, Armature, Car Deformation Rig to add the car rig. You'll see that you can only add the wheels in pairs even though we only need one wheel in the front. But for now, we're just gonna add one pair of wheels in the front and the back. For the wheels, we want to make sure that the origin point is exactly in the middle. If your wheel is perfectly round, setting origin to geometry shouldn't be a problem, but if it's not, select the edges or vertices that you know will be the center of the wheel, Shift S, cursor to select it, then back in object mode, right click, set origin to 3D cursor. Alright, now select the wheel, then Shift S, cursor to select it. Then in edit mode, select one of the front wheel bones, Shift S, selection to cursor. The bone should snap to the origin of your wheel. Do the same for the rest of the wheel bones and ignore this one. As for the body, the bone should be set right below the car. The tail of the bone should be right at the rear of the vehicle. This determines the drift. This part of the bone determines the pivot where your vehicle would pitch. If we place it too far back, it would turn out like this. Too far forward, and it'll look like this. So I'll set it to right about here. I'm just gonna bring these tails in a little, though I don't think they make a difference. Now we need to parent them. Apparently there's a way to name the objects correctly to omit this step, but I'm not going to. Instead, we can select the object, select the bone, Control Tab for pose mode, then select the bone, Control P, set parent to bone. Do that for everything else, then hit N, rig a car, and hit generate. Not too sure why it pops forward a little, but that's about it. Everything should work just fine. We can select the bone, hit tab, delete the bones we don't need, and that's pretty much how I did my rig. To be honest, the rig I have here is pretty janky. As you can see, the front wheel is not following the green arrows, and the reason is that I have a bunch of object constraints applied to this vehicle. What these object constraints do is that they force your objects to behave a certain way. So you can tell your object to copy the location, rotation, and the scale of another object. You can set limits too so that they don't go beyond certain values. You could parent objects, and you can even tell it to track to different targets, such as this steering handle that is tracking to the green arrows. So my janky little setup requires me to parent my front wheel to this pipe, so this constraint conflicts with the constraints that already come with the rig. It was causing issues that I couldn't figure out, so I had to make the judgment call and sacrifice the steering capabilities. Alright, now it's time to work on the animation. Before I work on the animation, I'm gonna first import the Vespa into the scene. Now instead of scaling up the Vespa, I'm gonna scale down the vehicle placeholder to match the Vespa. If I scaled up the character, this would happen to the hair, so let's not do that. Let's create an empty and increase the radius, parent the scene elements to the empty, and scale it down. Let's match the Vespa to the placeholder, add an object constraint, child of, and target it to the null, and there we go. Now let's import the coffee delivery boy. I don't know what these things are, but I'm gonna delete them. Okay, good, the rig is still working. So let's bring him to the Vespa, child of, target to the Vespa rig, set bone to dev body, then hit set inverse. Now I'm gonna post the coffee delivery boy. Okay, he's out of frame. Let's readjust the scale of the scene and parent everything back. Perfect. Now I'm going to keyframe some simple poses for the Vespa, right click, insert keyframe, and pick whichever transform that the rig controls use. So I downloaded some free textures of Venice on textures.com. Let's make sure that they're in the right scale, and let's use them as placeholders for now. That way we can judge the speed of the Vespa. Alright, so as mentioned in day 2, I'm going to change the speed of the vehicle. So let's select the camera and the parent null, both which animation are baked in. In the graph editor, we can isolate the axis that contributes to the animation, which in this case is the Y location. Then hit S to scale the selected keyframes and Y to make sure it only scales in the Y axis. Now normally it would scale like this, so we have to set the pivot point to 2D cursor and it should work. If it's not working, you have to select the keyframe, hit Shift S, cursor to selection, and there we go. Then I'm gonna clean up the keyframes a little and refine the Vespa animation. Alright, now it's time to talk about character animation because that's what we're about to do. So the first step in animation is creating your key poses. As the name suggests, these are the poses that are key to making the animation make sense. Right now, I'm animating the key poses of a punch, and once I'm satisfied with the pose, I'll select the entire rig except for the base, insert keyframe, location, rotation, and scale. And as you can see, we have 4 keyframes that we can now spread apart. But before we do that, we want to set the interpolation mode to constant instead of Bezier. This will disable any automatic interpolation in between the keyframes once you spread them apart, which is ideal for blocking out your animation. Now we're gonna spread the keyframes apart until the punch animation starts to make sense and feel snappy. Out of curiosity, I set it to Bezier and noticed that in between keyframes, the arm looked weird. In hindsight, I should have ignored it because we're about to add the in-betweens. As the name suggests, you want to insert new poses in between the key poses to improve your animation and make it more fluid. For this demo, I'm not going to add too many in-betweens, but you can definitely add more as you wish. Next, splining. Now, you can change the interpolation mode to whatever works for you. For this case, I'm picking Bezier. The more in-betweens you have, the less likely you'll face the weird arm issue that I had earlier. Another cool trick is that you can copy the pose and paste the flip version of it. This will come in handy later once we have to animate the run cycle. There are more to touch on this topic like smoothing and offsetting, but I won't be covering it here because for the most part I left it in constant mode for that stop motion vibe. Now let's apply whatever we just talked about and animate a run cycle. If you're unsure about the key poses that a walking and running cycle should include, there are plenty of online resources that you can refer to. Anyway, once we have a single run cycle, we can duplicate, Okay, now I'm gonna select the arm rig and delete the keyframes from 31 frames onwards. Then I'm gonna animate the action of him retrieving his cup. Alright, now we need a cup, so let's model that real quick. Then let's parent the cup to the hand, and we can keyframe the visibility of the cup, and there we go, he's taking a cup out of nowhere. Now I'm gonna animate the other arm, the thigh flinging about, the bike transformation. Okay, so let's talk about the wiggle of the bike stand. So open a graph editor, insert a keyframe on the desired rotation axis. In this case, it's X. Then in the graph editor, hit N to open up the side panel, click on modifiers, add noise, and play around with the settings. This is what it looks like without noise and with noise. Now let's animate the coffee delivery boy real quick, and we're done. Alright, let's talk about hair dynamics. It's actually pretty straightforward, so just turn on the hair dynamics in hair particle system, then make sure you have enough strand steps, both in your viewport, display, and render, then tweak the settings under structure. You can also increase the vertex mass if you're dealing with longer hair. Then under cache, you can set the number of frames you need to bake. Then hit bake, and you're done. These are the final settings for the Caffeine Addict. Now for the coffee delivery boy, instead of using hair dynamics, I utilized the force field settings just because it worked out better. And these are the final settings. Now it's time to bring the environment to life. So we're gonna import more images from textures.com and decorate the environment for the front portion of the sequence. Then we're gonna turn all these buildings into 3D, Ian Hubert style by adding edge loops around the doors, windows, and any ornaments we can find. Press G twice to slide the edges or vertices without stretching the UV, and press G 3 times to move them freely. Let's do that real quick. Let's hit I to inset these windows and doors with the borders. Alright, let's extrude the windows and the borders outwards, and then select the windows and extrude them inwards. Now we can select any stretch areas, hit U, Smart UV Project, and in the UV editor, move the UVs back to where they belong. On a duplicated mesh, let's rearrange the vertices to match the wooden panels and move them outwards. Add a solidify modifier, and now we have a facade. You can do this to as many buildings as you want, and even paint out areas that you don't need. And to do that, you need to first of all duplicate the image so you don't overwrite the original. In texture paint mode, select the clone brush and shift right click on the image, and the 3D cursor determines the region that you'll be cloning. Then brush over the subjects you wish to remove and keep repeating this until you're satisfied. Then make sure you save your image. Here are the assets that I ended up making, so now it's time to assemble them into the scene. Alongside my assets, I decorated the scene with assets from Botanic, Traffic, Polyhaven, and Quixel Bridge. So this is what we ended up with, and now it's time to move on to lighting and color grading. Okay, so the first thing we're gonna do is to give this scene an ambient light by throwing in a HDRI from Polyhaven. An ambient light is basically a baseline level of illumination casted from any unintentional light sources that are already present in the environment. For example, the daylight bouncing off buildings and objects, or overhead lights in a room. So they're kind of like an indirect light source. They also determine whether the tone of your shadows are warm or cool, hard or soft. So they play an important role of setting the mood of your scene. For this case, I picked a HDRI with a soft overcast. Next, let's add in a sun. Here are the settings. I should mention, instead of using the default settings, I'm going to use the settings from Photographer 4. Also, I've set the exposure to -2.5. Anyway, the sun gives the ambient a warmer tone and fills up the valleys. Since the sun is our strongest light source, it's our key light. Next, I'm going to use the Cloud number 9 spotlight from Gobo's Light Textures by B Production. A gobo is basically a light source that uses a stencil useful to project light patterns onto a surface. So I'm gonna cast a synthetic sunlight seeping through clouds onto the buildings in the back. You can call this a motivated light source. So a motivated light appears as if emitted from an existing light source. So you would think that this was casted from the sun when it actually isn't. Next, let's throw in a few more gobos as motivated lights onto the red buildings and the ground, both using the leaves number 8 spotlight. For this next portion of the sequence, I'm going to throw in a cloud number 9 spotlight as motivated light to fill up the valley and ground. Now for this portion of the sequence, I'm going to use a simple area light as an indirect light source to fill up the shadows a little, and this caustic number 7 gobo as a motivated light source to make it seem as if the red potion is catching the sunlight. I'm not gonna lie, they are a little too subtle to be useful. Then let's add these cookie cutters to emulate leaves getting in the way of the sunlight. Again, maybe a little too subtle. Then I'll add this geometric number 1 gobo to emulate the sunlight seeping through the roof. Next, let's use the leaves number 1 gobo as motivated light source for the sun seeping through the leaves. Looks a little harsh, but when it's out of focus with motion blur, it looks normal. For this tunnel, I'll use the leaves number 8 gobo to light it up. Lastly, I'll use the leaves number 1 gobo to break up the light a little. It's very subtle and there are no trees around for this to make sense, but it's a quick way to introduce a little imperfection. Now these super stretch buildings that are out of frame are here to naturally block off and bounce off light onto the scene to make it feel like it's actually an enclosed area. These spotlights in the back of the coffee delivery boy are rim lights, which are normally used to highlight the rim of your subjects to create a separation from the background. While I was editing this, I realized that light linking is already in its alpha stage for Blender, which will make this process so much easier. I seriously can't wait. Lastly, let's break down how I color graded the sequence. So I did a bit of comping in Blender just to make the muzzle flare of the thrusters glow and to add a little mist. Then I exported it out as a PNG sequence with the look under color management as none. So the first thing I did was to add some gain and contrast using the curves. Here's a little A and B. Next, I balanced the contrast of the sequence by keyframing some deeper shadows with the curves to come in only in the beginning and towards the end, since the middle portion of the sequence was generally already darker and had more contrast. Then, using the offset color wheel, I added some warmth. Here's a before and after. Then, with the color warper, I added some saturation to the sky. With the hue versus saturation curve, I added some saturation to the greens as well. Then I added more warmth. Next, with the glow FX, I lowered both the shine threshold and the spread. Then I changed the composite type to soft light instead of add, which was the default setting. This adds a nice milky roll off to the highlights. Then I added halation, which is this red halo that appears around the edges of bright areas of the image. This is an optical phenomenon that occurs in film, which I thought was a nice subtle detail that would help make the image look more analog. Then I added more warmth, this time with the color warper. Then with the luminance versus saturation curve, I lowered the shadows to remove some saturation from the shadows. Lastly, I added some fine 35mm film grain, one set in overlay for some less harsh, softer grain to break the image apart, and one set in hard light for some harsh grain to go over the image. So that concludes my thought process for the Endless Engine Challenge, 18 days for 5 seconds worth of animation. Yep. There are a few things that I wish I could improve on, the coffee sloshing around inside the container being one of them, but I ran out of time. I also wish that I had been more bold with the animation of the coffee delivery boy and the Vespa, but all in all, I had a lot of fun and learned a lot. If you enjoyed watching me turn this into this, consider subscribing. Thank you guys so much for watching. Watch this video next if you want to learn how to make your own cute 3D character. Bye guys.